just have to beat him up. Yeah.
All right, speaker. What's some stuff we have here for speaker?
You can go first.
Civil rights activist.
Okay.
Yeah, can we go down the line?
Sure.
I said pacifist.
Is that what made you think of pacifier?
Yeah, that's why I said that. I wasn't just completely off the mark.
Or
He also was African American, so he was kind of trying to make people feel empathetic towards him and all the other people that was treated.
and so and some of this stuff kind of becomes understood with it, but you're dealing with obviously civil rights movement since he's a civil rights activist. He is an African American. Something that you could, potentially kind of add to it, since we're dealing with racism, discrimination, along with being African American. He's also a victim, at some point, with it, has had to deal with things. Anything else that other people want to throw out besides those three?
He was a pastor.
Okay. And that's significant because he certainly makes biblical references, a lot of references to God. Later on in the year, we're going to read a letter from Birmingham jail that he writes literally from Birmingham jail. He has a ton of biblical references, allusions within it, which you would certainly expect coming from a pastor or minister. Pastor minister probably also gives him a sense of what with a lot of people. If you know that the person speaking is a minister, faith, credibility, things of that nature. It means something if the minister is speaking as opposed to the dentist is speaking, the doctor is speaking, the lawyer. You have different kind of expectations with each one of those professions that would be happening. And so, certainly if you're a person of faith, pastor, minister is going to mean something. But I think there's some credibility that would go along with it. You mentioned from a family standpoint.
Yeah, can I say father?
Sure. I mean, one of the more famous lines, I want my 4 little children to be judged by content of their minds and character, not the color of their skin. So sure, father. Again, now you came in here knowing who Martin Luther King Jr. was, but you can start to see again, just like we did with Steinbeck, there's a difference between going, this is a speech that is delivered by Martin Luther King Jr., and this is one delivered by a African American minister who's a civil rights activist. He's a peaceful civil rights activist, family man, certainly has been a victim, has kind of dealt with this stuff before. That is telling you more about where this would be coming from as opposed to Martin Luther King Jr. I think that's pretty good. Anything else anyone want to add to the speaker? About occasion, what were we coming up with?
Well, I said it was right before segregation was common in the civil rights.
Okay, so we're in that 1950s, 1960s civil rights era. So we're dealing with segregation, certainly discrimination. Civil rights era. Okay. Zach, anything to add on?
I just thought that was during the 1960s.
Okay. What is our actual date?
August 28th, 1963.
We just missed it. We're in day off.
Oh, yeah.
Where is it?
Lincoln Memorial,
Which is in.
Washington, D.C.
Okay, so we're in D.C., we're in Washington, D.C., we're in the nation's capital, and specifically the Lincoln Memorial, which we'll get into. Remember, Washington Monument is the, what's the official term? I forget what it's called because of the no, but the point you think.
Obelisk.
Thank you. And then the Lincoln Memorial, Lincoln Monument, you have Lincoln sitting in his big chair of granite. So he's basically standing in the shadow at the bottom of the footsteps of Lincoln. Audience. This is you folks.
Yes.
And again, we want to stay away from America.
We said American people. Is that the same thing?
When, yeah, I think in truth it will end up being the American people, but there are certainly segments of the American people, multiple ones. It's not just one. So what segments is he really trying to, hit with the speech?
Segregators, segregists.
We didn't have that word written
Racist.
down.
Racist. Those who segregate.
Which predominantly, not meaning all of these people, but predominantly it's going to be whites. He is obviously also speaking to,
The fellow protesters.
okay, fellow victims, people who are dealing with this as well. So you got victims.
We said future people, like we're still talking about it 55 years later.
Well, and what, like, Gettysburg Address, okay, with 1863 is when the Gettysburg Address is given. Lincoln is speaking to his audience, and yes, you could certainly go, there's some newspaper folks there, so he's kind of speaking to other people. What, from a media standpoint, would make, and technology, makes this speech different from the Gettysburg Address or, George Washington inaugural address, something along those lines?
At least different.
Yeah.
Wasn't it filmed?
It's filmed. I mean, most of you have seen it. You might not have seen it in its entirety, maybe some of you have, but you type in Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream on YouTube, you're going to get a whole bunch of clips of it. And there's a lot of microphones right there in front of them. There's a lot of cameras right there in front of them. So, you're talking about like future people and whatnot. I would think he's still trying to reach out to folks who are obviously, alive at the time, but you're talking about those who are older. And, with racist views, that tends to be something that if you're going to be brought up with, is going to kind of penetrate your psyche a little bit more. But you're, also speaking to the newer generation. So you got a combination of young, old, probably taking place. It is more of a nationwide thing. It's not just going to be to the people who are literally there. We touched on where this is taking place so far as our occasion, our setting. We're in the Capitol. Why pick D.C. as the place? I mean, it's not the most segregated city in the country in the 1960s. Could have gone down to Birmingham, which would be much more. But
It's where the laws are created.
so part of the audience that you're speaking to are the people who are in charge of changing laws. So you're dealing with the American government. You want some legislation to take place. And as we talked about this when we were doing it with the Grapes of Wrath, obviously your purpose and your subject is going to kind of change a little bit depending upon who the audience is. But certainly, yes, originally, what was the first answer that you wrote down for audience? American people. But it's important to understand what are the demographics of the American people that you're trying to hit, because when you speak to the whole public, you can't treat it as one large lump sum. There's nuances and different ways that you're going to approach different segments of that population. How about purpose and subject? What are we thinking?
For purpose, I said motivate people to change.
Okay. And not that it has to match up specifically with now particular audiences, but certainly white racist would be a person who we would want to change. So we'll go purpose, change, and then with the subject matter, you'd be looking at basically like treatment of African Americans in the country, people in general. Okay, that'd be a good one. What else?
Let's say unify.
Unify. And with unify, you could really be taking a look at multiple audiences from what we just listed. Primarily, who do we want to unify?
American people.
You're always going to go back to that. Probably you're going to be unifying whites and blacks. So the hope would be to unify, and I'm thinking about like thesis statement. So what would be the subject matter? Well, we would be trying to unify a divided country. Okay. Maria, anything to add on?
I said, advocate.
Okay. Switch colors here. And some of this stuff is going to sound like maybe we're repeating the same subject matter, which is going to be obvious because we're dealing with the same thing. But what are we trying to advocate?
African American rights.
Okay. So, just to save space, I'm going to put equal rights. Here, anything else?
I had express.
Express. What do we want to express?
He wants to express to his people that they all have a voice.
So those who have been oppressed, those who are victims, you do have a voice, you have an opportunity, you have a chance. So express hope for the oppressed. Nothing wrong with any of those four. Anything else people in general think of? I would say with change, unify, advocate, express, we probably have hit most of them. Some people you might say inspire, protest, fight. I mean, he is angry. Like he's a pacifist, but he's pretty upset. So there could be some condemning, some criticizing. The treatment, the mistreatment that has been taking place. So we can kind of add some stuff there if we want. And then last one, tone.
I said serious, motivational, inspiring, hopeful, and solemn.
Bethany, he didn't leave you a whole lot. He pretty
I
much.
asked her, I used her.
Inspiring. I forget.
Serious,
Serious.
motivational.
I was thinking motivational. I couldn't remember if it was that or just because I had said motivate, I thought of it.
Hopeful.
Hopeful. Okay.
And solemn.
Solemn. All right. Anything else? And keep in mind that these might not all, like, solemn and hopeful, I don't think would be two words that people necessarily are going to put together. And I mentioned that he's also angry and upset. But the tone can kind of change based on what the context, the content of the speech, as that varies, that tone can change as well. So you could have differing tones in different sections of the speech. So when I say angry, especially at the beginning, that doesn't mean that it can't become inspiring and hopeful, certainly later on. Don't feel like you have to have one tone that's going to perfectly encapsulate the whole entire work. You take a look at different chapters within the Grapes of Wrath, especially the expository one, those tones change quite a bit throughout the course. It's almost like you have a different author for each of those chapters that take place. But the hope would be that, okay, now we've taken a look at the whole context of the speech. We're more in line, more in tune with, okay, this would be an argument that he or she would be trying to get across. Now we're ready to start to figure out, okay, what would be some of the rhetorical devices that he starts to use within his speech, which means now when we write on our page, diddles. And we say it with a straight face, because it's a great word. Except for Ben, he chuckles.
Who's that?
You. So what were some devices you took note of? Anywhere throughout the speech.
Right at the beginning, the 5 score years ago, is that like an allusion to the Gettysburg Address?
Yeah. Which makes sense now that we've talked about like the occasion as to where he's at, because who's he standing right in front of? Abraham Lincoln. He goes 5 score years ago. A score is 20 years. Lincoln's, Gettysburg Address, which just referenced, 4 years ago. What happened 5 score ago that he's mentioning?
The Emancipation Proclamation.
So, 100 years ago, basically slavery was ended people were set free. We should now have equality throughout the country. But for 100 years, that has not started to happen quite yet. So sure, yeah, we have plenty of allusions taking place, specifically to President Lincoln. And yeah, it starts off immediately with that 5 score. With him standing right in front of Lincoln, it really kind of makes sense that that would be an allusion he'd be trying to make. So yep, no doubt that would certainly be one.
There's syntax on page 268.
There's syntax on like every single paragraph, I would say, pretty much throughout this
Yeah,
one.
but especially towards the end when he keeps repeating "let freedom,"
Mm-hmm.
and that just emphasizes the fact that he's really pushing for everybody to have equal opportunity.
We have a ton of repetition throughout the course of this speech. So we have "let freedom ring." We have, what would be other examples of words or phrases that get repeated?
I have a ring.
You took the cheapy answer. But you're right. Someone was going to say it, so you may as well get credit for it, right? What else? Now, at like the very beginning. Because what's getting compared with now?
That's a good answer. What'd you say?
Then. Specifically, when. That Ben was just talking about. Because you have that contrast between now and 100 years ago, Emancipation Proclamation, all that stuff. Now, this is the stuff that we're end up, still dealing with. He does a lot of repetition at the beginning of sentences. If you have a speech, there's a good chance that you're going to have a fair amount of repetition because it's a way to emphasize. It's not that you're passing out the speech to people. I mean, you have a copy of the text, but if you're listening to it at the time, you're not going to be reading it and following along. So why repeat ideas? So that you hear it over and over and over again, a point of emphasis. If you have to analyze a speech, expect that there's going to be a fair amount of syntax that's going to be taking place within there. A lot of parallelism could be happening. A lot of alliteration could be happening within the text as well. What else? Whether it be syntax or other stuff that we have going on. Or,
Not just a second metaphor now, but on page 606, it talked about chains of discrimination, like at the very top.
mm-hmm. And you could, like for a lot of these, and really if you, at the bottom of 625, 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. So you got manacles of segregation, chains of discrimination. Metaphor, I think, would make perfect sense. There's going to be some of these where people might kind of be going that they're seeing more imagery, with it, with reference to chains and whatnot. But no, I think metaphor would be a good example for that one. And that would be a good example of a metaphor in the sense that it's really kind of a one-time thing that he does. But then further down that page, he goes from a standard metaphor to an extended metaphor. What's his extended metaphor that he does on that page? Where he keeps going back to this comparison multiple times.
The check.
Yeah, like the bank, the check, the promissory note, insufficient funds, all of this. We received a bad check. So within that paragraph, which is what paragraph number 4, I believe, that America has defaulted on the promissory note, and now you're getting reference to all these things about giving the Negro people a bad check. So, check, bank, seems like all our extended metaphors deal with banks now, but check, bank, extended metaphor, you can really see the difference between these two. Doesn't mean one's better than the other. Doesn't mean that, Lauren, you shouldn't focus on this one and only do the extended metaphor. They're both valid, but it's nice to see a difference between the two, in such close proximity to one another.
Would it be an allusion to the Declaration of Independence when he quotes the people of these trees and stuff about it?
Yeah. You have allusions then, as you said, to the Declaration of Independence. and it's more of like an indirect one because he doesn't go, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. He does do more direct allusions when he'll go, to quote the words from the old Negro spiritual, and then he also does like "My country, 'tis of thee." So there's a lot of patriotic allusions that are taking place. Declaration of Independence, various songs, spirituals, but he's incorporating those things in. And again, why use Declaration of Independence? You're in the capital. Old Negro spirituals, part of the audience that you're going to try to be, kind of reaching out to. So he has a pretty good grasp of who he's speaking to, and then what examples to kind of pull in for.
Details, there's like all these weird, not weird, like specific ones, like let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, and then like let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. I don't know.
I probably wouldn't do details.
What'd you do?
Well, how did you describe those places? I mean, you're right in that you have details in that all these cities are being referenced,
Yeah.
or not cities, excuse me, states being referenced. But
I guess the bottom of 628 could be like imagery.
you have a ton of imagery.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of imagery when it comes to the landscape. You just read what, snow-capped?
Yeah, snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, Curvis Peaks of California.
Makes reference to like the sweltering summers
Yeah.
at various places. Might be. I think he mentions the red hills of
Yeah, that's a page.
is it Georgia. I think it's mentioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say with there you have a lot of imagery that's going to be happening. You could now when you go and again if you take a look at paragraph 9, so this is page 627, and you can have a lot of crossover with your devices, and this could be something that holds true with your Grapes of Wrath essays, where you could make a decision as to which one wants to go to. Paragraph 9, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow the situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. We got a metaphor going on there, in the valley of despair. You could go that we have details about all these places where racism is going, but how does he also present those details? Go back, go back, go back. Well, we just wrote that earlier is a form of syntax with the repetition, parallelism, sentence structure, all that kind of stuff. So you could still have details with all of the states that are being mentioned, but you might end up focusing on the repetition that's happening with go back. You might end up focusing on the description, the imagery of the slums and ghettos. The valley of despair, that we simply had. But certainly, why mention all those states? And not just those ones that we have, but you were talking about the snow-capped Rockies, other places throughout, Colorado, California, Georgia, Tennessee. Why mention all those things?
I think to say like that's primarily happening in Alabama, and I'm here in DC, but like there should be idea everywhere.
In the 50s and 60s, a lot of places would look at it as being it's a southern problem. It's not something that I need to deal with, but he's certainly, as we said, trying to talk to all of the American people, include as many folks as you certainly can. How about diction? So we haven't put anything there. Any types of diction jump out for you? Any words jump out as to there's some impact, there's some significance with it?
He uses a lot of words like despair, and those are just like negative tones. Like almost like words that give you like a pleading for help type of attitude.
Okay. So, like a pleading diction?
When he talks about like the Negro people, he says we a lot, so kind of like unifying diction.
And certainly, yeah, most of the time when he uses we, he's talking about fellow African Americans. I think going along with that unifying diction, there's a great example of it on page 627. Paragraph 6. Paragraph 6 starts at the bottom of 626, carries over to 627. Anyone want to take a guess as to what word with that unifying diction idea that he uses? And I would find it significant, obviously, in what the word implies, but I think it's significant in the fact that he doesn't have to use the word, but he chooses to use the word. I think about it first, so we'll let him try.
White brothers.
Not just white, but the use of the term brothers. Anna, was that what you were going to mention too? Yeah. Ben stole the answer. What could he have used instead of brothers? And it would still be fine.
Brotherhood.
But you're still like you're. Yeah, that's lame.
He could have chose friends or.
And still keeping white, because you said white brothers, so we go white people, white friends, white supporters, neighbors, yeah. And all those words would be fine. And no one would read it and go, I can't believe he referred to them as friends. He should have used the term brothers, you know. But he used the term brothers, which implies more unification, implies more, you know, a stronger bond, not just simply friendship, but almost like a relation that is taking here. And obviously the use of the word white to go along with it. So I like that example because you can see how, and unifying is a perfect description for it, it's a use of a word that he did not have to use, but it was appropriate for what he was trying to get across at that point with it. And there's no reason that you wouldn't still write about we. You know, Kate mentioned we. Absolutely, that would be unifying. This isn't an issue that just one person has to deal with, but this is an issue that many folks are going to have to deal with, and we have to stick together with it.
I don't know what word I would pick with this prediction, but he says satisfied like 100 times in this 7th paragraph.
Well, I think you mean, so you're not sure how, for like type of diction they would call it? And it's essentially going that we will, not that we are satisfied, but we will, what?
Not be
Until this happens, we will not be satisfied. So you have this, we will not be satisfied. You go earlier to, I know we mentioned this with repetition, but the use of the word now, you could kind of have like an urgent diction going along with it. I don't want to say like angry diction because it's not, you know, completely yelling, but there's a sense of urgency with it. You can't just meet us halfway. We're not going to be satisfied until this happens. When is this going to happen? Now. And I think satisfied now are good examples of standard, everyday, you know, English language, not anything fancy, but the way they get utilized, you certainly get a tone of urgency that could go along with it. And there's plenty more things that we could certainly include. Sam, you were talking about details earlier. His reference to, and be a little bit of like personalization happening with it, but his reference to his kids would be details.
Yeah.
You know, my children, I want them to be recognized for who they are, not the way that they appear to be. That could be a detail that you can kind of include with it. And keep in mind that you don't have to, like if you wanted to end up, you could even call that a personal detail. He's including himself into it. You could put an adjective in front of that if you wanted. The only one that you have to have an adjective for sure is going to be diction. But if you wanted to go with landscape imagery, personal details, and pleading diction, you would be able to certainly do that. Now, of the, or we might add, but of our purpose and subject, which ones do you think really encapsulate what it is he's trying to do? Okay. I picked one. Okay. Because if you pick change, that lets you use what kind of diction? We and brothers. Unifying diction. It's going to sound weird to go, he uses unifying dictions to unite people, but you could go, he uses unifying diction, extended metaphor, syntax, to change treatment of African Americans to promote equality. Now you got a thesis statement. You can go ahead and focus on it. Right. those steps that we did, that's essentially what you'd be trying to do for any rhetorical analysis. Seems easy when we do it.
It does. Basic for syntax. One of my examples in my essay was about the way that writers speak and how they speak in like kind of broken, choppy sentences because they're more uneducated. Did that work? Do you think it's syntax?
Is that part of a syntax paragraph? Or are you looking at other types of syntax? Or is the whole thing
I was
focusing
looking
on
at-
the way they speak?
It's looking at other syntax, the entire thing, but there's one, the one part where I think Al and Mother are in the car talking about like what's going on with their grandma. That interaction especially just had a lot of like dramatic.
Okay, so it's definitely, like, you're definitely looking at the dialect.
Yeah.
So you could refer to it as dialect, dialect is part of syntax. If everything that you wrote was about that, you could just call it an use of dialect.
Okay.
If you wanna have some parts be about that, and other parts be other aspects of syntax, you can lump it all together.
Okay, awesome, thank you so much.
Having it's like it shows up on the board. It's like, is this law? Debate.
I'll be like the rectangle square concept.
Job
at that.
On Twitter. He's like, everyone shut up. I got a job at that. Watch your language. It's like, shut up, old man. It's like, I'm actually the head of the